Welcome to another episode of Art Heals All Wounds. I'm your host, Pam Uzel. On this show, we meet artists transforming lives with their work. Before we meet today's guest, I wanted to let you know that today is the last episode of Season 1 of Art Heals All Wounds. Some of you may know this already, but I started this podcast in response to the pandemic. This pandemic has highlighted the inequities and dysfunction in our society. Artists who often rely on performance, exhibitions, and audience had the rug pulled out from under them. Would it be possible to pivot to an online, virtual presence during this time of physical isolation? Many artists absolutely pivoted. With this pivot came lots of frustrations, but also a lot of brilliance and even opportunity. New ideas were born from necessity. The very special guest on today's podcast is opera composer Hector Armienta. Hector is also the art director of Opera Cultura, a Latino Hispanic opera company in San Jose, California. As a Mexican-American composer, Armienta composes operas that explore what it means to be in between two cultural worlds. His musical inspiration encompasses the works of Puccini to Mexican corridos to mariachi. What is it like to brave crossing the border in the hopes of finding a better life in America? What about farm workers, people who work in homes, cleaning and caring for children, young people who thought they were finally fulfilling their dream to attend college? What happened when March 2020 brought this pandemic that turned all of these dreams upside down? Hector Armienta interviewed Latinx immigrants in San Jose and Santa Clara Valley and gave their stories voice, a beautiful operatic voice, in his operas Cuentos and Mi Camino. I admire Hector's compositions immensely. They're so beautiful, but it's his vision that's really exciting. He pushes the preconceived boundaries of opera and theatrical performance with his work. Speaking of pivoting, during the pandemic, when live performances weren't possible, he created an animation for the opera Mi Camino. His intention is to take opera beyond the restrictions of borders, pandemics, and cultural or political boundaries. He's taking it into virtual reality, augmented reality, and extended reality. If the Metaverse is coming, having Hector's music there will make it a much warmer and human space. You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Listen and let us inspire you. Have you ever met someone who is just so charming and attractive that you found yourself just swept away? Pretty soon, though, you begin to notice that there's some things that are just off about them. But by that point, you're just in too deep. I'm talking about my dog here, Cupid. My partner and I found the absolute cutest rescue Chiweenie with big, brown, melting puppy eyes and these cute little stubby legs. We took one look at Cupid and we had to have him. It was love at first sight, and he loved us back so hard. In fact, he loved us way too hard and decided that it was his duty to rip the face off of any living creature, human or otherwise, that came near us. I'm sure you can imagine what it was like to take him for a walk every day through the neighborhood. On walks, Cupid was a bad, bad boy. But like I said before, we were in too deep. For better or worse, Cupid was ours for keeps. One afternoon, on one of these terrible walks, I met a neighbor, Hector Armienta. Hector also has a little dog, a very good boy named Troy. Cupid did his usual growling and lunging at Hector, but he was really taken with Troy. And even though Cupid lunged and snapped at him, Hector would say really nice things like, "Oh, Cupid's a very good dog. He's just protecting you," and other reassuring things. Even having one person say good things about Cupid gave me hope that I could live with this very good, very bad dog. After learning more about Hector's work and story, it doesn't surprise me that he was so kind. His artistic career has been a labor of love, especially for his Latinx community, both those whose stories he shares and those who see the performances that celebrate their culture. I'm so glad that Hector is joining me today on the Season 1 finale. Hi, Hector. Thank you so much for being a guest on this episode of Art Heals All Wounds.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. I've been looking forward to this, Pam.
Yeah, me too. Can you start by introducing yourself a little bit? What do you do?
I'm a Mexican-American composer. Most of my work is in opera. I've written some symphonic work and some choral work, but I'm most known for my work writing opera that speaks to the Latino community, our Latinx community.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I know a lot of musicians, but I don't know any other opera composers. You're the first one that I've met, and I'm so curious to hear how you wound up. Like, what was your path to getting there? How does one become an opera composer?
Yeah, that's been a journey. So back in the day, when I was a young in college, I actually was writing. I'd studied classical music. I was a pianist. I played Beethoven, Chopin, all of that when I was in high school. But when I got to college, I started writing actually R&B and then some dance music and easy listening. Then after I graduated, I started to veer more toward classical music. And as a musician trying to get work, or composer trying to get work, I sent out, a bunch of cassettes. People don't know what those are anymore.
I do.
You do. So I sent out a bunch of cassettes to everybody and anybody. And this opera company in Orange County, Southern California, wanted to do a project that focused on the Latino cultural experience. And that sort of began my trajectory into writing opera.
Wow. Well, I listened to as much of your work as I could find online, and your music is incredibly beautiful. Can you talk a little bit about musically what your opera compositions are like?
Well, one thing that's unusual is that most opera composers do not write their own libretto. And for those of that don't know what a libretto is, it's basically the text to the opera. So if it was a musical, someone would write the book, then someone would write the lyrics, someone writes the music. I actually write both the music and the words. So, as someone, as a Latino and sort of as a Chicano Latino, which means that when I grew up, we were somewhat aware of our unique circumstances and the political climate then. I always felt it was my, fate or responsibility, but to do work that spoke to the Latino community, and that was about the Latino community. So I often do work is based on, Mexican folktale or based on a book or, something that most people would be familiar with. Yeah.
What about musically? What are your inspirations for composing musically?
Well, that's another good question. So I was trained as a classical musician. I went to California Institute of the Arts for my undergrad. And then years later, I went to the San Francisco Conservatory of Music and studied composition with a wonderful teacher named Conrad Sousa, who wrote the music to Dangerous Liaisons and some other work. So I'm trained classically, but I often incorporate musical idioms, or you could think of as musical ideas or musical constructs that refer back to the, sort of the Mexican-American music or the Mexican music. And that's a very broad, because in Mexico and here in the States, it's all over the place in terms of, where we draw from. And it's also part of my exploration as a Mexican-American, and if you visit my website, I talk about sort of being on the border between, musically speaking, and between the U.S. and Mexico. So I like to write pretty music.
It is pretty. I agree with that.
So people often say, your music's so beautiful, Hector. And it's not structurally, it's complicated because opera is just inherently difficult. But melodically, I like to write beautiful melodies. And so I've studied a lot of the Italian operas, Puccini and Verdi. And I've also studied Benjamin Britten, who's a wonderful English composer.
I don't know him, but definitely I became a fan of opera through Puccini's work because it is so beautiful. But That's interesting that you say that he was an influence for you, because your opera was so incredibly moving for me. Some of them I was crying as
really?
Yeah. And I want to ask you about one of those in particular, but before we do, you said something that reminded me of what I read in your bio on your website, which is that you compose opera as a way to explore your identity between two worlds. Can you expand on that? You started to talk about it a little bit, about this idea of being on the border between Mexico and the U.S.
Yeah, so in terms of what I grew up listening to, I'm a second generation Mexican American. I wasn't, I did not immigrate to the United States. My mother grew up in Texas. My dad was from Mexico. But, we at home, we listened to all kinds of music. We didn't necessarily listen to Mexican music. We listened to Frank Sinatra and Doris Day, Tom Jones, and those are the interests of my mother. And sometimes we would listen to mariachi, but not often. And so, I didn't grow up in Mexico listening to corridos or rancheros or banda music, banda music is sort of that sounds like polka because it's, it has, there's a whole
accordion.
Yeah, because it comes from when the Germans came and were mining the silver and the gold back in the day. But so it's an exploration of who I am. Spanish was not the language that I grew up speaking. I've learned more as I've gotten older. My work is often in what they call Spanglish, which is, how we grew up talking. We would talk in combination. Our sentences would be English and Spanish. And many of my operas are like that. My most recent operas, like Zorro, which is premiering in January, there's much more Spanish in it. And then my last work that I did was an animated film opera called Mi Camino. That was actually mostly in Spanish because we can talk about this, but it was based on interviews of farm workers. And so their text was in Spanish. Their words were in Spanish.
I noticed that when I was watching. I thought also, is it Cuentos? Cuentos was the one that made me cry.
Yeah.
Both the music and the story. And I am not fluent in Spanish by any means, but I could understand enough. And then what I saw was a video of it and the way that it was staged. A lot of the staging filled in some of the gaps in what I could understand. I was wondering if we could talk about Cuentos a little bit. Did you say that, did I read correctly that you also interviewed people for that opera?
Yeah, so both Cuentos de Peregrinación, which is Tales of Pilgrimage, and the new work that I did, Mi Camino, they're sort of they're sister projects. They're part of a larger project called La Frontera, the border. And so Cuentos was based on video interviews I took of people that had immigrated and what their lives were like in San Jose. And there was a young woman who talks about the incredible journey and difficulty and challenges of crossing, the mountain and hoping to find water and wanting to give her daughter who was deaf an opportunity. And then about a young man who remembers working in the fields and his clothes being soaked in the early morning, from the dampness and the feeling of picking, produce with his hands and the cuts. And so that was really interesting work. And it was stage directed by Kinan Valdez, a wonderful stage director, whose father is actually Luis Valdez, who started El Teatro Campesino, which El Teatro Campesino was when Cesar Chavez was protesting. Luis Valdez, Teatro Campesino, they would do theater in the fields.
Wow.
So Kinan, the director, worked with community members who were not actors. And so there would be this aria, we call it, aria is like a song, I'm simplifying. And if it was about crossing the border, if the aria was about crossing the border, he would work with these community members, not actors, to help weave that story. And so you would see them and sort of reenact what it was like to cross. He's a brilliant director.
Wow.
So it was a really interesting work.
I have a couple of questions, both in terms of craft and in terms of emotion in writing these operas, because first of all, the craft of taking these interviews and then writing, what is it? Libretto?
Yes.
The libretto. I'm curious about that. I'm also curious. I mean, I did find some of the stories very heartbreaking, and I'm wondering about what that experience was like for you as an artist to work with this sort of material?
Well, thinking of Cuentos specifically, which was based on video interviews, and then the interviews I did of farm workers during the pandemic. And it's a little different than a typical opera because they're really, I'm simplifying again, there's songs where there's not one, it's not character driven, there's no protagonist or antagonist. And they're really just, they're each piece is within its own, each 3-minute piece. But it was very difficult for me because that was not my experience. I've never, we were low income and struggled financially to some extent. But I never had to endure what farm workers have to endure. And there was one in particular where I was interviewing these two young ladies. One was going to San Francisco State. The other one was going to San Francisco State and San Jose State. They grew up, I think it was Watsonville or Gilroy. They worked in the summers, and then they were in school. And when the pandemic hit, no more school. So they had to go back and now work there, permanently. And they were telling their stories of, difficulty of just getting up in the morning and doing, 10-hour shifts, and how they've had these dreams of being a lawyer or a social worker. And one of them was crying. And if you saw the video, there was, in the animated opera, there's actually video footage of one of the interviews. And listening to that text, was very hard. And then there was another lady who was not a farm worker, but I interviewed her, and she was working as a cleaning lady in homes. And she said on the 10th of March, all her employers said, don't come. And she was destitute. And then her boyfriend had also lost his work. He was a construction worker, and she did not know what to do. So that one's called the 10th of March, of Diez de Marzo. And she was just, it was very hard to listen to her, even thinking about it now.
Yeah. Well, I am curious. I would love for you to talk about Mi Camino a little bit more. Because of the pandemic and no live performances, you took a radically different approach with this composition and these sets of stories.
Yeah, so I'm also a general director, artistic director of Opera Cultura, which is a San Jose-based opera company. It's the only professional Latinx opera company in the country. And so each year, we have a season and we produce. And so we were going to produce an opera. We had to cancel it. So I thought, well, what are we going to do? I still want to do something. And so as a hobby, I play around with video game development, so I don't know, some people do bowling, some people do landscaping and gardening, but I do video game stuff. But anyway, I was researching more about this software called Unreal Engine, and it's used a lot. It's been used in the last, 4 or 5 years more toward film. So I said, well, why don't we tell these stories in the virtual world? The end product was that I created 2 virtual worlds, one in Gilroy and one in Half Moon Bay, which is where some of these interviews were taking place. And in those, we placed real singers singing these arias based on the video interviews. And then we would cut in between scenes where you actually see avatars and their faces were based on pictures of the singers.
Wow.
Yeah, and I worked with a wonderful film director, Trisha Cris in Valencia, and Ramiro, I forget his last name. He was a film editor. And then I worked with another company, but he had he had a production company in Santa Cruz, and that's where we did where we put the singers in front of a green screen, and then they were placed into the virtual world.
Wow.
But I did the avatars, and I create the avatars in the virtual worlds, and oh my God, it was so much work, more than I ever thought it was. Yeah. But now I'm thinking of a new project, which would be very interesting, which is, well, I don't know if you want to talk about that now, but I can mention it later.
We can, yeah.
Okay, well, the other project I'm thinking about is doing an immersive theater experience that is focused on some sort of, Latinx, I don't want to say holiday, but cultural event. And this is going to be complicated to explain, but there would be one person who would wear a VR set, virtual world set, and they would explore the world that I would create for them. And they would interact with a live performer, but that live performer could be an avatar. They would only see the avatar. And then what that one person is experiencing in the physical space, right, but is really seeing a virtual space, would then be broadcast to the audience so that they could experience it firsthand.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure I understand all the layers.
Yeah. Well, just pretend that you have a virtual, those VR sets like an Oculus.
Yeah.
And you're in the virtual world. But
yes.
you're not, but you're watching it on your screen. And someone else in another place is doing it for you.
Okay.
Yeah, I know. It's a little crazy. It's out there. The challenge with these immersive, as I'm describing these immersive theater experiences, when you use virtual reality or augmented reality, is that you can't have 500 people come together and experience it. It's really, groups of 5 people, and they put on a VR set, and they're in a black box space. And then they have, for them to be mobile, you have to have a computer attached to them.
Yes.
So it's very limiting. So I'm trying to figure out a way where one person can be in that physical space, right? Like in a small little room, but that everybody who's in their living room can see what that person sees. So that's what I'm trying to explore in terms of, is the technology there.
Oh, that's so interesting. Well, that's really good. It sounds like you were very inspired. Your love of video games and opera came together because of the pandemic.
Yeah.
You briefly mentioned that you have another work, Zorro, coming up. Can you talk about that work? First of all, what is it? And both musically and in terms of story, what is Zorro?
Sure. Well, I have Zorro, which is being produced in January in Fort Worth, Texas. And then a reduced version of another opera titled Bless Me Ultima, which is based on the novel, Mexican-American novel, Rudolfo Naya. That's going to be in January in Modesto. And then the first opera, which I mentioned earlier, which is called Un Camino de Fe, which is based on the story of a young girl coming from Mexico. That's being produced by Portland Opera. So I have 3 productions going up that I'm not producing, that someone else is producing. But Zorro is based on the legend of Zorro. It's the same, sort of story, masked man who comes to save the day. But what I like to do, which is, I was inspired by sort of how Isabel Allende does, where it's, she draws from history. So I place Zorro in a historical context, which is, early 19th century Spain, Mexico, and Alta California, which is what we used to call California. And the backdrop is this political turmoil that's happened in Spain with sort of the king and the son's king, and how Bonaparte was trying to exert control. And that created all these opportunities for revolution in Mexico and in California. So that's the world that Zorro is going to inhabit. He comes, he's a Spanish lineage, but revolution is in the air. And it draws on all that political turmoil and the history of what was happening in Spain and Hidalgo, so it's going to be a really interesting piece. When it's first performed, I'm excited to see how the audience responds.
And that one's in Fort Worth?
That's going to be in Fort Worth, and then it goes to New Mexico in 2022, and then my company's producing it in 2022, and there's probably 2 more productions in 23, 24. So it's there's a lot of interest in it, which is really, really exciting. And then musically, I was just going to say, musically, it's it's again sort of traditional opera, but it incorporates there's a corrido, which is a Mexican sort of folk song style, and then there's a somewhat quasi mariachi piece, and then there's a flamenco piece in it too. So it's got a lot of stuff. Yeah.
And what is Bless Me Ultima?
Bless Me Ultima is a really wonderful story. It was written by Rodolfo Naya, a very famous Mexican-American novelist. He passed away recently. He was awarded the was a national award or National Honor Award. I can't remember specifically, which was presented annually by the presidents. And it's a story, and it's the most well-known Mexican-American novel, taught in high schools and sometimes in colleges. It's a story it's from the perspective of a young boy in early New Mexico, 1940s, and comes from a very sort of Catholic upbringing. But an older woman named Ultima, who's a curandera, and a curandera is someone who is in connect, understands the power of nature to heal, and also understands the power of forces that are unseen. So she exposes this boy to that sort of, I don't want to say magical, but the world that lives between the real and the unreal, the things that are unseen, the power of the mountains and the rivers and all of that.
So maybe mystical.
Yeah. So it's a great story. It's a really powerful story.
Yeah. You said it's going to be produced in Modesto?
Yes. Yeah. The full production was produced in 2018. And this is a shorter, condensed version, smaller cast, smaller orchestra. It's about an hour long, and it's in January. Opera Modesto is producing it.
Maybe I'll get tickets to see that one too.
Yeah, it should be fun.
Yeah. I'm going to press you a little bit more about this question of exploring your identity between these two places. The other thing I read on your website is that you're not Mexican. You're not American, you're Mexican-American. What does that mean to you when you say that? And how do you think your work has helped you explore that?
Being Mexican-American in California is not the same as being Mexican-American in Texas, and not the same as being Mexican-American in New Mexico or in Arizona. Even within each state, sometimes the food we eat or the expressions that we use or the way that we grew up is very different. Even when I'm back, with family or old friends, my real Chicano LA accent really kicks in, and so it's just very different. And so when I've traveled to Mexico for, either holiday or for some production, I'm not Mexican, there's just different. And as an artist, growing up as an artist, that voice was not really being heard. Robert Rodriguez was, as far as I know, the first Mexican-American opera composer. He wrote an opera based on the life of Frida, which my company is producing. But he's, I think, in his 70s now. And I'm the second one. And there are other ones, there's some other wonderful composers around. But, there wasn't really anything that was it wasn't the stories of our community. Like Bless Me Ultima, which is a Mexican-American story. And there are Spanish operas, and I've had this discussion and this controversy and heated discussions with some of my colleagues. Are you a Spanish composer, Hector? And I said, well, no, I'm not a Spanish composer. Meaning I don't write my operas in Spanish because that's not my cultural experience. We talk in Spanglish, and when we get really excited, the more Spanish kicks in, but that's how we are. And when I produce my work, there is just a different, my audiences are mostly Latino. And, like when we were doing a show, I have a show called La Llorona, which is about the Mexican folk legend of La Llorona, the weeping woman. And, when you go to a regular opera house, people are quiet. They don't talk. But when my community comes out and sees my show, it's like they're watching a novela. And they're talking out loud, and it's like the only thing's missing is passing the chips or something, or or something. I shouldn't say chips because it's a community event for them, and that's a very Mexican American sort of, I think, California experience.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. You've made me think of one last question. I haven't asked you yet much about Opera Cultura. Can you tell a little bit about, you're the artistic director, is that true?
Yeah, Opera Cultura grew out of a growth, out of a need for me to have a platform to do my work. when I started writing opera, because I started late in life. I started really in my 40s, early 40s. When I started writing opera, they were just, I'd knock on doors and no one would answer. No one would take my calls. No one. So I said, well, think about my mom, who's always been an inspiration about her strength and just, challenges she's faced. And I said, well, if they're not going to give me a platform to show my work and produce my work, then forget it. I'll just do my own. And so Opera Cultura started 2008. And it's grown into a pretty good, large company, I say not large, but, for a culturally specific arts organization, it's doing really well. And it's also allowed me an opportunity to create more opportunities for artists and artists of color in particular. They're not always necessarily, Latinx. And as well as I have a deep commitment to young people. And, my day job used to be, about 20 years ago, was teaching. I would teach in schools in communities of color and just see the disparity of opportunities. And so part of our work is educating youth, providing them training. And in fact, we're starting a new program called La Escuela, which means the school, which will train young people of color as performers, but also in technical theater, with the goal that it would be at some point, 3 to 5 years down the road, it would be a semi-quasi school for maybe young people who don't necessarily want to go to a 4-year, but want to get training. And I also think, and this is part of where the video game stuff happens, and sort of what I think the new sort of boom is going to be, which is more in technology and video games, sort of going outside of video game, but into film production and into theater and all of that, is also to train them in this technology that is being harnessed to you in theater and in museums and in film and TV. So that's the goal. That's Opera Cultura. It's a platform for me to develop my work, but also create opportunities for other people and arts education for young people.
That's completely the future.
Yeah. And we can have a totally separate long conversation about, the influence of technology and, VR and AR and XR and these things they're calling them Metaverse and, Facebook's push to move from a quote social media company to what are they calling themselves and something else, a Metaverse company. I don't know, but that's a longer discussion.
It is, and the idea of the Facebook Metaverse terrifies me, but I have to admit that
it terrifies a lot of people, but they're not the only ones. They're not the only ones.
Yeah. Well, Hector, thank you so much for being on here. If people want to find out more about you and your work, where can they look?
Well, there's two websites. One is the Opera Cultura website, which is www.operacultura.org. And then my composer website, which is my first and last name, www.hectorarmienta.com.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
It was a joy. Always a joy, Pam.
It's always a pleasure to see you as well. You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Remember to be in touch on my Facebook page, Art Heals All Wounds, and also on Twitter and Instagram at Art Heals Podcast. I'm so grateful to Hector Armienta for being a guest on this episode. If you want to learn more about Hector and hear his beautiful music, you can visit his website, hectorarmienta.com. That's HectorArmienta.com. You can read more about him as well as find video clips from his work. You can also find out more about him and Opera Cultura by visiting operacultura.org. That's operacultura.org. Visit that page for news about upcoming works as well as updates on La Escuela, an educational program through Opera Cultura to train and mentor young people of color in the arts and technical theater direction. This episode was edited by Eva Hristova. The music you've heard in this podcast is Yellow Light District and Autowaschenlage Instrumental by Lobo Loco. Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 15 in D major was performed by Karina Galanian. The beautiful music that you heard in the intro were two of Hector Armienta's compositions, the first from Cuentos and the second one from Mi Camino. Thank you for listening to this season of Art Heals All Wounds. I'm filled with gratitude for all the artists who shared their stories here. I learned so much from every single one of them, and I'm so grateful to those of you who listened. Thanks for the shares and the comments letting me know what was meaningful for you. It keeps me inspired and helps me to remember why I love making this show. I have lots of plans for season 2 with amazing guests and some new things I'm excited about trying. So look for me back early next year in 2022. In the meantime, I'll be dropping some little nuggets in the feed just to keep in touch between seasons. If you're enjoying what you hear on Art Heals All Wounds, please give it a 5-star rating and even a review if you feel inspired.